In Silver Creek, one powerful man owns the cattle, the water, and nearly every frightened voice in town. But when Abigail Vance arrives to reclaim her husband's stolen land, Sheriff Silas Thorne must choose between the comfort of silence and the danger of truth. The West may be ruled by guns and gold, but sometimes the smallest voice can bring down the biggest empire. This story gives us a powerful lesson. When good people stay silent, injustice grows roots. But when one person dares to speak, a whole community can remember its courage.
The air in the high country doesn't care about your regrets. It's just cold, thin, and honest. At 4:48 a.m., the ranch house at Blackwood was as silent as a grave. Silas Thorne sat at his heavy oak desk, the wood scarred by years of hard use and harder thoughts. He struck a match. The sulfur smell bit at his nose, a sharp, waking sting. He lit the first oil lamp on the left, then the second by the window. This was the ritual. Order was the only thing keeping the chaos of his mind from spilling over. He pulled his ledger toward him. His handwriting was precise, a soldier's script. Fix the north fence. Check the irrigation ditch. Forget the past. He stared at that last line. Then he took a pen and drew a thick, black stroke through it. He'd been trying to cross out that line for 4 years. It never quite faded. Silas stood up and looked at his hands. They were calloused, stained with grease and earth. He practiced a certain kind of philosophy with these hands. He called it the busy man's lie. I tell myself that if I work until my bones ache, I'm doing a good thing, Silas said aloud to the empty room. His voice was gravelly from disuse. But I've learned something bitter over these winters. Busy hands are a poor substitute for a quiet heart. I'm not being productive. I'm just running. And a man who runs from himself eventually runs out of road. He blew out a breath that fogged in the freezing room. He reached for the silver star sitting on the corner of the desk. He didn't pin it on. Not yet. He just felt the weight of it. He walked onto the porch. The sky was that deep, bruised purple that comes just before the sun breaks the horizon. The wind moaned through the rafters of the barn. The town thinks I'm a pillar, he muttered, leaning against the railing. They see the badge and the big house, and they think I've got the world figured. They don't see the rot. The truth is, a secret kept is a debt that gathers interest. I thought I was protecting the peace by staying silent about that night in the canyon. But silence isn't peace. It's just a noise you haven't heard yet. He looked toward the main trail. Most mornings, there was nothing but the silhouettes of the pines. But this morning, there was a shape. A horse, head low, hooves heavy in the mud, and a rider slumped but holding on. Silas straightened his back. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a strange, sudden dread. He had a feeling the road he'd been running on had finally come to an end. The rider moved into the faint circle of light from the porch lamp. It was a woman. Her coat was soaked through, her face pale as a ghost in the moonlight. She looked up, and for a second the world stopped turning. She didn't look like a stranger. She looked like a consequence. "Help!" she whispered. The word broke in the air. Silas stepped off the porch. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew her eyes. He had seen them every night for 4 years, right before he closed his own. "I'm coming." He reached for her, and as he did, he felt the first crack in the dam he'd built around his soul. He was about to let the water in. He just didn't know if he was strong enough to swim. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered. It was the kind of cold gray deluge that felt personal, like the sky was trying to wash the very skin off your bones. I hauled her into the house. She was light, too light, like a bird with broken wings. I set her down in the armchair by the hearth. I didn't ask questions. You don't ask a drowning person about the tide. I just worked. I threw 3 more logs of seasoned cedar onto the embers. The fire roared to life, snapping and popping, casting long, dancing shadows against the pine walls. She sat there, shivering so hard her teeth rattled. I brought her a wool blanket, thick, scratchy, and warm. She wrapped it around herself, her fingers peeking out. They were white as bone. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were a deep, haunting amber. "I need to pay," she said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't tremble. "You need to get warm," I replied. "The rest can wait." She shook her head. She reached into her sodden coat pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar. She placed it on the small side table with a faint clink. "Please sell me a night of shelter," she said. She stared at me, her gaze steady. "I don't take charity. I've found that free things usually cost the most in the end." I looked at that coin. It looked lonely on the wood. "Ma'am," I said, leaning against the mantel, "a man who charges a woman for a roof in a storm like this isn't a businessman. He's a vulture. And I've spent my life trying to stay on the right side of the fence." I paused. I wanted her to hear the weight of what I was about to say. "Dignity is a fine thing to hold on to," I told her. "But there is a difference between pride and self-preservation. Real strength isn't just about what you can endure on your own. It's about knowing when to let another human being carry the load. We are built to be social creatures, and turning away a helping hand out of fear of being beholden is just a different kind of cage." She looked at the fire, considering my words. Then she looked back at me. "My name is Abigail Vance," she said. The name hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The room seemed to tilt. Vance. I knew that name. I had written it in a ledger I kept locked in my bottom drawer. I had seen it on a wooden cross in a lonely canyon 40 miles from here. I kept my face like stone. 30 years of poker and law work taught me how to hide a heart attack behind a blink. "I'm Silas Thorne," I said. My throat felt like it was full of dry sand. "I know," she whispered. "People in town said you were a man who knew the law, and I've come a long way to find out if the law in Colorado is as crooked as the trails." She leaned forward, the firelight catching the damp curls of her hair. "My husband, Caleb, bought a piece of land out here, 320 acres near the creek. He died before I could join him." The letters stopped. Then, a lawyer sent a note saying the land was gone. "Debts," he said. But Caleb didn't believe in debt. He believed in dirt and sweat. I looked away from her. I looked at the silver star on my desk. It felt like it was burning a hole in the wood. "The trouble with the truth is that it doesn't care if you're ready for it," I said, my voice low. "We like to think the world is a fair place, Abigail. We like to think that if we work hard and play by the rules, we get what's ours. But the world is often run by men who write the rules just so they can break them. Silence isn't just a lack of noise. Sometimes, silence is a tool used by the powerful to bury the small. And I've been silent too long." She didn't ask me what I meant. Not yet. She just watched me. "I'll stay the night," she said, touching the silver coin. "But tomorrow, Mr. Thorne, I want to see my land, and I want to see the man who says it isn't mine." I nodded. I knew I couldn't say no. Not to her. Not after what I'd done. "Sleep," I said. "The guest cabin is through that door. It's warm. It's safe." I watched her go. When the door clicked shut, I picked up that silver dollar. It was cold. I stood there for an hour, watching the fire die down to gray ash. I realized then that I hadn't just opened my door to a traveler. I had opened the door to my own reckoning, and I was terrified. The morning arrived with a pale, sickly sun. The storm had moved east, leaving the world dripping and smelling of wet pine and old regrets. Abigail was waiting on the porch when I stepped out. She was wearing a clean shirt, likely one she'd kept dry in her saddlebags, and her hair was braided tight. She looked like a woman who had come to do a job. "You look like you didn't sleep, Sheriff," she said. She didn't call me Silas this time. She used the title like a challenge. "I've forgotten how," I replied. We saddled up in silence. My big bay, Jasper, was restless. He could feel the tension in my hands. We rode out toward the western edge of the valley, where the creek cut a silver line through the high grass. As we rode, the beauty of the country felt like a lie. "We look at a landscape and see majesty," I said, breaking the quiet. "But land is never just land. It's a map of who had the power to take it and who had the heart to keep it. Every acre has a story, usually written in blood or ink, and often both. To own a piece of the earth is a heavy thing. It's a responsibility to the past as much as the future." Abigail pulled her horse up near a cluster of jagged rocks. "Caleb wrote to me about these rocks. He said they looked like the teeth of the world." She climbed down. She walked into the tall grass, searching for something. She stopped at a rotted cedar post, barely visible above the weeds. It had been chopped down, not fallen. "This was the marker," she said. Her voice was flat. "Someone moved the line. Hard. Someone on my horse." I felt the sweat prickling under my collar, despite the mountain chill. "Sterling's cattle graze this side now," I said. She turned to look at me. "Sterling, the man you mentioned last night. The one who writes the rules. He's a man who believes that enough is a word for people without ambition," I said. I swung down from the saddle and stood beside her. I felt a sudden, urgent need to tell her a truth, even if it wasn't the truth yet. "Abigail, hear me on this. A lie told often enough doesn't become the truth, but it does become the law if nobody stands up to stop it." I looked her square in the eyes. "We are raised to respect authority, to believe that the men in the fine suits and the tin stars are the guardians of what's right. But authority is just a coat. If the man underneath is rotten, the coat won't hide the smell. Real justice doesn't come from a gavel. It comes from the courage to look at a wrong and call it by its name, even when the whole world is telling you to shut your mouth." She stepped closer. She was small, but she took up a lot of space in that moment. "You speak like a man who has seen a lot of rot, Silas," she said. "And you speak like a man who is tired of the smell." I looked away, toward the high peaks. "I was there," I whispered. It came out before I could stop it. "Where?" "In the canyon, 4 years ago." She froze. The wind whistled through the rocks, a lonely, grieving sound. "The night Caleb died," she said. "It wasn't a question." "There was a report," I said, the words tumbling out like stones. "Sterling," I said, "there were raiders, squatters, men with guns." I was a deputy marshal then. We went in fast. It was dark. There was a shadow, a man with something in his hand. I thought it was a rifle. I didn't wait. I was trained not to wait. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had built her a fire last night. "It wasn't a rifle," I said. "It was a surveyor's stake. He was just trying to mark his home." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Abigail didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her face turning into a mask of cold, white marble. "A mistake made in the dark is still a crime in the light," she said. Her voice was a whip. "You can wrap it in a badge and call it procedure, Silas Thorne, but you took a father from a child and a husband from a wife because you were afraid of a shadow. And then you let that shadow stay over the truth for 4 years. "I know," I said. I felt smaller than I ever had. Accountability is the price of being a man, she continued, and every word felt like a nail being driven home. You can't buy your way out of it with a warm blanket and a kind word. To truly respect a human life, you have to be willing to destroy your own comfort to make things right. You've been living in a house built on a lie, and the foundation is rotting. She turned her back on me and looked at the teeth of the world. I'm not leaving, she said. I'm staying on this land. And you, Sheriff, you're going to help me take it back. Not because you like me, but because it's the only way you'll ever be able to look in a mirror again. I didn't argue. She was right. I climbed back onto Jasper, the silver star on my chest, feeling like a brand. I had wanted to forget, but Abigail, Vance had brought the light, and there was nowhere left for a coward to hide. The air between us on the ride back was different. It wasn't the cold, sharp silence of two strangers anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a judge and the accused. Abigail rode her mare with a stiff spine, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could see the ghost of Caleb Vance walking among the sagebrush. I watched her from a few paces behind. I felt every bump in the trail in my marrow. We need to stop at the county seat tomorrow, I said, my voice cutting through the wind. Sterling's claim on this land is built on a debt note. If I can find the original filing, we can see if the ink was dry before your husband was. Abigail didn't look back. She just kept riding. You think a piece of paper is going to fix a hole in the earth, Silas? No, I said. But it's a start. Law is a tool, Abigail. Like a hammer or a plow. It can be used to build a home, or it can be used to break a man's knees. To live in a civilized society, we have to respect the system, but we also have to realize that the system is only as honest as the men holding the tools. If we don't hold the law to a higher standard than the men who profit from it, we aren't living in a democracy. We're just living in a kingdom with better paperwork. She slowed her horse until we were side by side. The sun was dipping low, painting the peaks in a bloody red. You speak well for a man who helped pull the trigger, she said. I took the hit. I deserved it. I'm not trying to talk my way out of the grave I dug, I told her. The first step to true moral recovery is admitting that you were a participant in the wrong, even if you were just a cog in the machine. Ignorance isn't an excuse when justice is on the line. To be a citizen, you have to be awake. To be a man, you have to be responsible for the shadow you cast, even when you didn't mean to block the light. We reached the ranch as the first stars began to prick through the purple sky. I went to the barn to brush down the horses. It was a rhythmic, mindless task. The rasp of the brush against Jasper's coat was the only sound in the gloom. Abigail appeared in the doorway. She wasn't holding the blanket anymore. She was holding her husband's old surveyor's stake. She had pulled it from the dirt and brought it back with her. Why didn't you tell the truth that night? She asked. The sun came up the next morning. You saw he was unarmed. You saw the stake. Why didn't you go to the marshal? I stopped brushing. I leaned my forehead against the horse's warm flank. Because I was a coward, I said, and because I was told it was for the greater good. Sterling told me the town needed his cattle. He said the mining interest was the only thing keeping Silver Creek from becoming a ghost town. He told me that if I admitted the mistake, the whole region would fall into chaos. People would lose their jobs. Families would starve. I looked at her, my eyes stinging in the hay dust. The greater good is a lie that men tell when they want to justify a small evil, I said, my voice shaking. There is no such thing as a collective morality that outweighs the rights of a single, innocent human being. When we start weighing lives against profit or social stability, we have already lost our souls. Every person has an inherent right to their life and their dignity, and no amount of economic progress can buy the right to take that away. I traded Caleb's life for the town's comfort, and in doing so, I made the town a place that didn't deserve to exist. Abigail walked into the barn, the light from the lantern hanging on the post, catching the sharp edges of the wood in her hand. "At least you're saying it now," she whispered. "Saying it is the easy part," I replied. "Fixing it is where the bone breaks." We spent the next hour in the house, lit by a single lamp on the kitchen table. I pulled out my old maps and the copies of the regional filings I'd kept in my private safe. I was looking for the dates. "Look here," I said, pointing to a signature. "This is Sterling's hand. He filed the lien on Caleb's property 3 days before the night in the canyon. He didn't just take the land after the accident. He planned the accident to take the land." Abigail's breath hitched. "He knew Caleb was out there. He sent you knowing what would happen. He sent a man who was tired and looking for a fight," I said. "Evil rarely looks like a monster, Abigail. It looks like an opportunity. It looks like a man in a position of trust who sees a way to get a little bit more by pushing a little bit harder. Corruption isn't a single event. It's a slow erosion of the rules we all agreed to live by. And once the rules stop applying to the man at the top, they stop protecting the person at the bottom." She touched the map, her fingers tracing the boundaries Caleb had died for. "We're going to the county seat," she said. "We're going to find the original deed. It won't be easy," I warned. "Sterling owns half the men in that office. He's built a cage of paper and gold around this valley. Then we'll break the cage," she said. I looked at her, and for a moment, I didn't see a grieving widow. I saw the fire that Caleb must have loved. She wasn't just fighting for her land. She was fighting for the idea that a person's life meant more than a cattle baron's ledger. "Human rights aren't something given to us by a government," I told her, feeling a spark of something I hadn't felt in 4 years. "Hope. They are things we are born with. They are the air in our lungs and the thoughts in our heads. A man like Sterling can take your house, he can take your money, and he can even take your life. But he can only take your rights if you agree that his power is more real than your worth. I agreed to that for a long time. I'm done agreeing." "Get some sleep, Silas," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "Tomorrow is going to be a long ride." I stayed up after she left. I cleaned my revolver, a Remington I'd used since the war. I didn't want to use it. I hoped I wouldn't have to. But I knew the world I lived in. "Peace is a noble goal," I whispered to the empty room. "But a peace built on a foundation of hidden graves is just a war that hasn't started yet. And true peace only comes when the truth is allowed to breathe. And if the truth has to be defended with iron, then that's the price of a clear conscience." I blew out the lamp. For the first time in 4 years, the darkness didn't feel like it was trying to swallow me. It felt like it was waiting for the sun. I lay down on the cot in the main room and closed my eyes. I didn't dream of the canyon. I dreamed of the road ahead. It was steep and it was rocky, but it was the only road left. The town of Silver Creek would wake up tomorrow and see the same Sheriff Thorne they'd seen for years. But they were wrong. The man who had stopped living had decided to stand up. And the woman who had come for answers was going to lead him right into the mouth of the storm. We were two people bound by a tragedy, learning to walk toward the light. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something rarer in the West. It was the shared recognition that a human being, no matter how small, no matter how lonely, is a thing of infinite value, and that value was worth every bullet in my belt. I spent the morning in the basement of the courthouse. It was a place where the air went to die. It smelled of damp limestone, old ink, and the kind of secrets that only grow in the dark. I was looking for the evidence log from 1874, specifically the night in the canyon. I found the crate. It was tucked behind a stack of tax liens from the 50s. I pulled it out, the wood groaning against the floor. I opened the lid, and there it was. The small leather satchel Caleb Vance had been carrying when he fell. It was empty. I sat back on my heels, the cold of the floor seeping into my joints. I remembered that satchel. It had been heavy, solid. I'd handed it over to the clerk back then without checking the contents because I was too busy trying to keep my hands from shaking. I stared at the empty leather. We are taught from the time we can walk that the record is the truth, I said to the empty room. My voice sounded hollow in the stone vault. We believe that if a thing is written down in a ledger or locked in a box, it becomes a fact. But a record is only as honest as the man who keeps the key. If we stop questioning the evidence because it's official, we give up our ability to see the world as it really is. Blind faith in an institution is just a fancy way of being a sheep. I looked at the logbook. The entry for the satchel said, "Personal effects. Return to estate." That was a lie. Abigail hadn't received a thing. I realized then that my mistake wasn't just the pull of a trigger. It was the pull of my own ego. I had been so focused on my own guilt that I hadn't looked for the greed of others. Guilt is a selfish emotion if it keeps you from the truth, I whispered. It's easy to sit in a room and hate yourself. It takes no work at all. But seeking the truth requires you to set aside your own feelings and look at the hard, cold numbers. If you only look at your own shadow, you'll never see the man holding the candle. I climbed out of that basement feeling older than the hills. I went to meet Abigail at the edge of town. She'd spent her morning differently. She'd gone to find a man named Ezra Hobbs. Ezra was a man who used to keep the books for the Sterling Cattle Company. He'd retired 3 years back to a shack near the creek because he'd developed a cough and a sudden desire for solitude. Most people in Silver Creek called it fear. I saw Abigail sitting on a stump outside Ezra's shack. She was holding a tin cup of tea, and Ezra was sitting across from her, looking like a man who had seen a ghost. I pulled Jasper up and dismounted. "Did he talk?" I asked. Abigail looked up. Her eyes were bright, sharp. "He talked, Silas. He didn't want to, but he did." She turned back to Ezra. "Tell the sheriff what you told me, Mr. Hobbs, about the Vance ledger." Ezra looked at me, then at the star on my chest. He flinched. "It wasn't my doing, Sheriff," he croaked. "I just wrote what I was told." Sterling came to me in November of '74. He told me to open a new line for a man named Caleb Vance. He told me to backdate the entries. 6 months' worth of feed, seed, and timber. $1,200. $1,200? I asked. Caleb hadn't been in the territory for 6 months back then. "I know that," Ezra said, his voice trembling. "But Sterling," said the man, "owed it. He said if I didn't write it, I'd be the one owing. And Sterling is a man who collects on every debt." I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. "Numbers don't lie, but the men who write them do," I told Ezra. I wanted him to feel the weight of it. When we use our skills, whether it's with a gun or a pen, to steal from the innocent, we are committing a crime against humanity itself. You think you were just doing your job, Ezra. But a job that requires you to erase a man's life is a job for a criminal. There is no such thing as being an innocent bystander when you are the one holding the ink. Ezra looked down at his boots. He knew I was right. Sterling didn't want the land just for the grass, Ezra added, his voice barely a whisper. He knew Caleb had found something. Caleb was a surveyor. He wasn't just looking at the dirt. He was looking at the water rights. That canyon, it's the only reliable spring for 30 miles during a drought. If Sterling owns the canyon, he owns every rancher in the valley. Abigail stood up. She poured the rest of her tea onto the dry earth. He murdered him for water, she said. He used me to do it, I corrected her. We left Ezra's shack and rode back toward the ranch. The sun was hanging low, casting long, thin shadows that looked like bars across the trail. Every person has a right to the fruits of their labor, Abigail said as we rode. Caleb didn't come out here to get rich. He came to build a future for us. He worked for every inch of that dirt. For a man to sit in a fine office and decide that work is forfeit because he wants more, it's a violation of everything this country is supposed to be. If a man's property isn't safe from the greedy, then no man is truly free. I looked at her. She was vibrating with a quiet, controlled power. Freedom isn't just the absence of chains, I replied. It's the presence of justice. It's the knowledge that the law will protect you, even if you don't have a penny to your name. When the law becomes a tool for the wealthy to harvest the poor, the social contract is broken. We owe it to each other to fix that break, no matter the cost. Because if we don't protect the rights of the smallest among us, we've got no right to call ourselves a civilization. We reached the ranch house, but we didn't go inside. We stood by the fence, watching the horses in the corral. I found the satchel today, I told her. It was empty. What was in it, Silas? Originally? Ezra said Caleb found the water rights, I said. I reckon the original deed and the survey maps were in that bag. Sterling took them. He took the proof that Caleb owned the spring. Abigail gripped the top rail of the fence until her knuckles turned white. Then we have to find them, she said. Sterling's house is a fortress, I warned, and he's got 10 men on the payroll who don't ask questions. I don't care about his men, she said. I care about the truth. I looked at the silver star on my chest. I unpinned it. I held it in my hand, feeling the sharp points. A badge doesn't give a man authority, I said, looking at the tin star. It only gives him a responsibility. If I can't use this to stop a man like Sterling, then it's just a piece of cheap metal. We like to pretend that the law is this grand, untouchable thing, but it's not. It's a living, breathing choice we make every day. Today, I'm choosing to be a man instead of a sheriff, because a man can do what needs to be done, even if the law says he shouldn't. I handed the star to her. Keep this, I said. If I don't come back from Sterling's place, you show this to the circuit judge. You tell him that Silas Thorne finally decided to do his job. She didn't take the star. She pushed my hand back. You're going to come back, she said. Because you owe Caleb more than a confession. You owe him a legacy. You're going to help me put his name back on that land. Honoring the dead isn't about flowers or headstones, Abigail said, her voice steady and true. It's about finishing the work they started. It's about standing up for the values they died for. Caleb believed in a fair shake for everyone. He believed in the truth. If we let Sterling win, then Caleb dies a second time, and I won't let that happen. I pinned the star back on, not because I believed in the system, but because I believed in her. We go tomorrow night, I said. Why tomorrow? Because tomorrow is the monthly cattleman's dinner in town, I said. Sterling will be there, bragging about his empire. His house will be quiet, just a few guards. Sometimes you have to walk in the shadows to bring things into the light, I told her. It's not the way I wanted to do this. I wanted a courtroom and a jury. But when the courtroom is bought and the jury is scared, you have to find another way. The moral path isn't always the straight one. Sometimes the only way to get to the truth is to go around the lies. Abigail nodded. She looked toward the western peaks, where the canyon lay hidden in the purple dusk. I'm going with you, she said. It's dangerous, Abigail. Danger is a small price to pay for your soul, Silas, she replied. I've spent 14 months being a victim. I've spent 14 months waiting for someone else to fix my life. I'm done waiting. A person has a right to be the hero of their own story. If I let you do this alone, I'm just trading one protector for another. I want my land, but more than that, I want my agency back. I looked at her, and I knew there was no point in arguing. She was a woman who had found her footing on a rocky trail, and she wasn't going to let anyone lead her by the hand. All right, I said. We go together. We went into the house then. We didn't talk much. We just ate our salt pork and beans in the quiet. But it wasn't a heavy quiet anymore. It was the quiet of two people who had found a common purpose. Trust is a fragile thing, I said as I washed the plates. It takes years to build and a second to break. I broke yours 4 years ago, before I even met you. I don't expect you to trust me tonight, but I expect you to trust the truth. Because the truth is the only thing that's going to get us through Sterling's Gate. I trust you to be the man you're trying to become, she said. That was enough. It had to be. I lay down on my cot that night and looked at the ceiling. The debt didn't add up. The ledger was a lie. The satchel was empty. But for the first time in a long time, the man in the mirror was starting to make sense. A man's worth isn't measured by his mistakes, I whispered into the dark. It's measured by what he does after he realizes he's made them. Redemption isn't a gift you get from God. It's a wage you earn with your own sweat and blood. And tomorrow, I'm going to start paying my way. I fell asleep then. No dreams. Just the steady, rhythmic breathing of a man who finally had a direction. The storm was coming, but I wasn't running anymore. I was standing my ground. And for a rancher in the Colorado Territory, that was the only way to live. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that precedes a change in the weather or a change in a man's soul. I spent the early hours in the barn, oiling the tack for the ride to Sterling's. Every strap of leather felt like a promise. Every buckle felt like a vow. I looked out the barn doors and saw Abigail. She wasn't at the house. She was walking toward the small, one-room schoolhouse at the edge of the ranch property. The regular teacher, Mrs. Gable, had come down with the mountain fever, and the town was in a lurch. Abigail had volunteered to step in. She didn't ask me. She just put on her best shawl and went. I finished with the horses and walked over. I didn't want to intrude. I just wanted to see her in a world that wasn't full of blood and ledgers. I stood by the window, hidden by the shade of a large cottonwood. Inside, the room was full of the Miller kids, the Baker twins, and a handful of others. They were rowdy. They were the children of ranchers and miners, hard-headed and quick to wander. But they were silent. Abigail was sitting on the edge of the teacher's desk. She wasn't pointing a finger or raising her voice. She was reading to them. Something about a traveler in a far-off land. I watched the way the children looked at her. It wasn't fear. It was wonder. When the noon bell rang, the kids spilled out like water from a broken dam. Abigail stepped onto the porch, smoothing her skirts. She saw me leaning against the tree. "How long have you been lurking, Silas?" she asked. There was a faint smile on her lips. "Long enough to see a miracle," I said. I've seen those Miller boys tie a cat's tail to a church bell. I've never seen them sit still for an hour. I walked up to the porch steps. The right to learn is the first step toward true freedom, I told her. I wanted her to know I understood what she was doing. We think of education as a luxury, or something we do, because the law says so. But knowledge is the only weapon that doesn't require a holster. When you teach a child to think for themselves, you're giving them a shield against the liars of the world. You're giving them the ability to see a man like Sterling for exactly what he is before he even opens his mouth. Abigail nodded, her eyes soft. Ignorance is the soil where tyranny grows, Silas, she replied. A person who can't read their own deed is a person who can be easily evicted. I'm not just teaching them stories. I'm teaching them that their minds have value. Every child has an inherent right to understand the world they live in. If we don't give them the tools to navigate the truth, we're just raising a new generation of victims. Empowerment starts with a book, not a bullet. We walked back toward the ranch house together. The sun was warm on our backs, a brief reprieve before the night we had planned. You're good with them, I said. I was a teacher back in Boston, she said, before Caleb and I decided to chase the sunset. I missed it. I missed the feeling of a room coming alive when a new idea hits the air. When we got back to the house, we found a crate on the porch. It hadn't been there when we left. I opened it with my pocket knife. Inside was a fresh loaf of bread, a jar of preserved peaches, and a side of smoked bacon. There was no note. The neighbors, I said. The bakers, most likely. I looked at the food, then at the road leading toward the other ranches. Community isn't just a collection of people living near each other, I said. It's a mutual promise of protection. We like to think of the West as a place of rugged individuals, every man for himself on a horse. But that's a loner's fantasy. Real survival in a hard country depends on the invisible threads that tie neighbors together. When people share what they have without being asked, they're building a fortress that no cattle baron can knock down. This bacon isn't charity. It's an investment in our shared humanity. Abigail touched the jar of peaches. Mercy is the glue of a civil society, she added. It's the choice to care about another person's hunger as if it were your own. When we lose the ability to feel for our neighbor, we lose the right to call ourselves a community. Sterling thinks he's powerful because he has money, but he's the poorest man in the valley because nobody would ever leave a jar of peaches on his porch out of love. He only gets what he demands. We get what we've earned through kindness. We took the food inside. It was the best meal I'd had in years. Not because of the taste, but because of the intent behind it. After we ate, Abigail went to the corner of the parlor. There was an old upright piano there, draped in a moth-eaten sheet. It had belonged to the woman who owned this ranch before me, a widow who had lost her heart to the winter and moved back east. I'd never touched it. I didn't have the hands for music. Abigail pulled off the sheet. Dust danced in the afternoon light. She sat down and pressed a key. It was out of tune, a sharp, lonely sound. She began to play. It was a slow, haunting melody. It filled the room, seeping into the cracks in the walls and the cracks in my heart. I sat at the table and just listened. I didn't know the name of the song, but it sounded like a prayer. When she finished, the silence that followed was different. It was a peaceful silence. "Why did you keep it?" she asked, her hands still resting on the keys. "The piano." "I don't know," I said. Maybe because I knew I couldn't make that kind of beauty myself, and I didn't want to be the one to throw it away. I walked over and stood behind her. Art is the evidence of a soul that hasn't been crushed by the dirt, I said. In a place like this, where we spend all our time fighting the wind and the wolves, it's easy to forget that we were made for more than just survival. Beauty is a human right, Abigail. We need it like we need water. It reminds us that there is a world beyond the fence line, a world of ideas and feelings that can't be measured in acres or head of cattle. If we stop making music, we might as well be the animals we're herding. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the widow Vance. I saw a woman who was starting to see me too. The ability to appreciate beauty is what separates a man from a monster, she said softly. Caleb used to say that a home without music was just a shelter. He wanted this valley to be more than a workplace. He wanted it to be a place where a person could breathe. You kept this piano because you still have a spark of that in you, Silas. You haven't let the canyon take everything. I reached out, my hand hovering near her shoulder. I didn't touch her. I wasn't ready for that yet, and neither was she. We should get ready, I said. The sun is getting low. We spent the next hour checking our gear. I checked my Remington one last time. I checked the cinch on the saddles. I checked the map I'd drawn of Sterling's estate. Preparation is the difference between a hero and a martyr, I told her as I tightened the straps. We don't go into a fight hoping for the best. We go in knowing the ground. We go in with a plan. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the mastery of it through discipline. If we lose our heads tonight, we lose everything Caleb worked for. We owe it to the truth to be the smartest people in the room. Abigail was checking the laces on her boots. She looked up at me, her face set in a grim, determined line. Justice requires more than just a good heart. It requires a steady hand, she replied. We can't just be right, Silas. We have to be effective. The world doesn't reward the person with the best intentions. It rewards the person who stays standing until the end. I'm not going to Sterling's to make a statement. I'm going to get what belongs to me, and I'm going to do it with my eyes wide open. I led the horses out of the barn. The sky was turning a bruised purple, the same color as the night in the canyon 4 years ago. But this time, I wasn't riding toward a shadow. I was riding toward a reckoning. One more thing, I said, holding the reins for her mare. Yes? A person's past doesn't have to be their anchor, I said. I needed her to hear this. I needed me to hear it. We like to think that the things we've done define us forever. We think we're trapped in the ruts of our own mistakes, but every morning is a chance to pick a new trail. You're not just a goafu, and I'm not just a shooter. We are people who are choosing to be better than we were yesterday. That choice is the most powerful thing a human being possesses. It's the right to a future that isn't dictated by the past. Abigail took the reins. She looked at me for a long moment. I know, she whispered. She mounted her mare with a grace that came from weeks of hard riding. I swung up onto Jasper. Let's go, I said. We rode out of the ranch gate, heading north toward Sterling's lights. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain and wood smoke. True courage is walking into the dark when you know exactly what's waiting for you, I said, as we picked up the pace. It's easy to be brave when you're ignorant. It's hard to be brave when you know the cost. Tonight, we're paying the price. But for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm buying. Abigail rode beside me, her silhouette sharp against the rising moon. We're buying back our lives. Silas, she said, and that's a bargain at any price. We didn't talk after that. The horse's hooves made a steady, rhythmic thrum against the earth, a heartbeat for the valley. We were moving toward the mouth of the beast, But for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I was finally coming home. The lights of Stirling's manor appeared on the hill, a glowing, arrogant fortress of stone and glass. It looked down on the valley like a king on a throne. But kings fall. And today, two people who had been pushed into the dirt were coming to collect a debt. Equality isn't something that's given, I whispered to the wind. It's something that's taken back. Every human being is born with a dignity that no man can legally steal. Stirling thinks he's bigger than the people he hurts. Tonight, we're going to show him that the smallest person in the world is a giant when they're standing on the truth. We reached the edge of his property and slowed the horses to a walk. The shadows swallowed us up, and the real work began. The night of shelter was over. The fight for forever had started. The manor didn't just sit on the hill. It loomed. It was a monument of stacked limestone and arrogance, looking down on the valley like it owned the wind itself. Stirling had built it to be a fortress, but every fortress has a flaw. Most of the time, the flaw is the man inside who thinks he's untouchable. We left the horses in a dry wash half a mile back. We moved through the tall grass, belly low. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. I've been in gunfights. I've chased outlaws into the high peaks. But this was different. I wasn't hunting a criminal. I was hunting a ghost. Stay close, I whispered. The guards circle every 20 minutes. They're lazy. They think the hill is their friend. Abigail didn't say a word. She just nodded. She was moving better than most deputies I'd trained. She had a grace born of desperation. We reached the back terrace. The stones were cold under my palms. I jimmied the lock on the study window, a trick I'd learned from a stagecoach robber back in '68. The window slid up with a faint, oily hiss. We stepped inside. The room smelled of expensive tobacco, old brandy, and the kind of power that doesn't care who it crushes. It was a big room, walls lined with books no one ever read. A desk made of mahogany that probably cost more than my entire ranch. Find the satchel, I said. We went to work. I started with the floorboards under the desk. Abigail went for the wall, safe behind a painting of a prize bull. She had a way of looking at things, searching for the gaps, the places where the truth might be hiding. Then she found it. Not a safe. A hidden drawer in the side of the mahogany desk. It clicked open, revealing a stack of papers and a small, leather-bound journal. Silas, she whispered. I walked over. She wasn't holding the land deeds. She was holding a file with a silver star embossed on the cover. It was the internal report from the marshal's office. The one I'd written 4 years ago. The one I thought had been burned. She opened it. Her eyes moved fast. I saw her face change. The warmth left it, replaced by a gray, stony stillness. You wrote this, she said. It wasn't a question. I did, I said. My voice felt like it was coming from the bottom of a well. You wrote that Caleb was evasive. You wrote that he appeared to reach for a hidden weapon. You wrote that the shooting was justified under the circumstances of a high-risk pursuit. She looked up at me. Her eyes were like shards of glass. But you told me yesterday he was just a man with a stake. You told me he was innocent. I reached for the paper, but she pulled it away. The written word is a dangerous thing, Silas, she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. We think of a report as a record of facts, but it's often just a shroud we wrap around the truth to make it look like justice. When a man in power uses his pen to rewrite a tragedy into a justified event, he is committing a crime against the very concept of human rights. You didn't just take his life that night. You used this paper to take his dignity. You robbed him of the right to be remembered as an innocent man. I sat on the edge of the desk. I felt the weight of the mahogany, the weight of the house, the weight of the 4 years. I did it because I was told that the peace of the valley depended on it. I told her. I wasn't making excuses. I was trying to explain the rot. We are raised to believe that the stability of the community is more important than the truth of a single man's death. We call it social order. But a social order built on a lie is just a slow-motion collapse. I realize now that every human being has an absolute, non-negotiable right to the truth, regardless of the consequences to the town or the government. When we withhold the truth to protect the system, we aren't being patriots. We're being accomplices to a theft of the soul. Abigail slammed the file down on the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Transparency isn't a gift that the powerful give to the weak. Silas, she said, stepping into my space, it is a fundamental requirement of a free people. If we don't have the right to know what our protectors are doing in our name, then we aren't citizens. We're just subjects. You sat at my table, you ate my bread, and you let me believe that you were a victim of a mistake. But this paper shows you were a participant in a cover-up. You chose the comfort of your badge over the rights of a grieving widow. I looked at her, and for a second, I wanted to run. I wanted to climb back out that window and disappear into the mountains. But I stayed. Accountability is the only thing that makes a man worth his salt, I said. I kept that report because I couldn't bring myself to burn it. I wanted the evidence of my own shame to exist somewhere, even if it was in Sterling's pocket. I was wrong to stay silent, Abigail. I see that now. Silence in the face of injustice is a form of bowlook, violence. It's a quiet way of saying that the victim doesn't matter. But Caleb Vance mattered. He had a right to his life, a right to his land, and a right to have his story told accurately. She picked up the file again. She didn't put it back. She tucked it into her shawl. We're leaving, she said. We haven't found the deeds yet. This is the deed, she said, tapping the file. This is the proof that the law was used as a weapon. This is the evidence that the rights of an American citizen were trampled by a man with a tin star and a man with a checkbook. I don't need Sterling's permission to own my land. I need the truth to be public so the world knows he has no right to it. We heard footsteps then, heavy boots on the hardwood hallway outside. The handle of the study door turned. I pulled my Remington. I didn't want to use it, but the time for talking was over. There comes a moment when a person has to decide if their life is more important than their principles, I whispered as the door creaked open. I spent 4 years choosing my life. Tonight, I'm choosing what's right. Every person has a right to defend the truth, even when the truth is ugly, and even when the truth is dangerous. If I have to bleed to get you out of this room with that paper, then that's the price I'm willing to pay. The door swung wide. A guard stood there. A big man with a double-barrel shotgun. He didn't even have time to raise it. I was faster. I didn't shoot to kill. I shot the lamp on the wall behind him. The room exploded into fire and shadows. "Run!" I yelled. We scrambled out the window. The cool night air hit me like a splash of water. We ran for the wash, the sound of shouting and whistles rising behind us, like a pack of wolves. We reached the horses. I swung up onto Jasper, my heart still racing. Abigail was already in her saddle, the file clutched to her chest. "Shield. The truth is out of the box now, Silas," she said as we spurred the horses toward the trees. "And once it's out, you can't ever put it back in. You've finally done the right thing, but don't think for a second that it makes us even. You still owe the world a version of Silas Thorne that doesn't hide behind a desk. I know, I said. We rode into the dark, the lights of the manor fading behind us. We were still in danger. Sterling would be coming with everything he had. But for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel like I was carrying a mountain on my back. A person's worth is measured by their willingness to stand in the light, even when the light burns, I said to the wind. I'm standing in it now, Abigail, and I'm not going back to the shadows. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away. We rode together, two people bound by a report, a ranch, and a sudden, terrifying clarity. The geography of lies had been mapped. Now all that was left was to see who was left standing when the truth finally hit the valley. Respect for the truth is the foundation of all other rights, I thought, as the ranch appeared in the distance. Without it, we are just lost in the woods, waiting for the monsters to find us. But as long as we can speak the truth, we have a chance to find our way home. We reached the gate. The night was far from over, but the air felt cleaner. The shelter was gone. The truth was here. And in the Colorado Territory of 1878, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The ride back to Blackwood was a blur of black pines and gasping breath. We didn't talk. The horses knew the way. Jasper's hooves hit the dirt with a heavy rhythmic thud. It sounded like a clock ticking down to zero. Every snap of a twig behind us made me reach for my holster. But it wasn't Sterling's men I was afraid of. It was the woman riding beside me. We reached the ranch as the moon was hit by a shelf of clouds. Total darkness. I led the horses into the barn. I stripped the saddles in the dark. My hands were steady, but my mind was a riot. Abigail stood in the doorway. She was a silhouette against the gray night. She was still clutching that file. The star on the cover seemed to catch the only light left in the world. Inside, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I followed her into the house. I struck a match and lit the lantern on the kitchen table. The yellow light stretched out, weak and flickering. It didn't reach the corners of the room. It just illuminated the two of us. Two people at the end of a long, crooked road. Abigail sat down. She laid the file on the wood. It looked like a tombstone. Tell me, she said. Her voice was flat. Not the version you wrote for the marshal. Not the version you told the town. Tell me what happened in that canyon like you're standing before the Almighty. I sat across from her. I leaned my elbows on the table. I looked at the grain of the wood. Anything but her eyes. It was raining, I began. My voice was a gravelly rasp. A cold, miserable drizzle. Sterling had been in my ear for a week. He told me Caleb was a thief. He said your husband was part of a gang of land jumpers coming to burn out the local ranchers. I was tired, I was young, and I wanted to be the hero Sterling said I was. I paused. I took a breath. It felt like breathing in broken glass. I saw him by the creek. He was kneeling. He had his back to me. I shouted for him to put his hands up. He started to turn. He had something in his right hand. Long, dark. In that light, with the rain in my eyes, I convinced myself it was a Winchester. But it wasn't, Abigail whispered. No, it was a surveyor's stake. He was just trying to find the corner of his dream. I looked up at her then. I had to see the hurt. I owed her that much. I learned a hard lesson that night. Though it took me years to admit it to myself, I said. I made sure my voice didn't waver. The truth isn't a commodity you trade when the price is right. It's an absolute obligation you owe to every other human soul, regardless of the cost to your own skin. By lying in that report, I didn't just protect my job. I stole your husband's right to be remembered as a good man. A person's history is their most basic human right, and I used a tin star to rewrite his life into a lie. That is a theft no amount of money can ever pay back. Abigail opened the file. She touched the ink of my signature. You wrote that he reached for a weapon, she said. You lied to make yourself look like a soldier instead of a man who made a mistake. I did, I said, and that is the rot of it. We often confuse legal with moral. I told myself that because the marshal accepted my report, the matter was settled. But a government seal doesn't make a lie into a truth. It just makes it an official lie. Every human being has an inherent right to an honest accounting of their end. When we allow the state or the powerful to smudge the facts for the sake of order, we are saying that the individual doesn't matter. But every individual matters. Caleb mattered. Abigail stared at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. It was something deeper than tears. It was a soul-deep exhaustion. Why come to me now? She asked. Why help me tonight? Because I realized that my silence was a secondary injury, I replied. An apology without a full admission of the specific harm is just a way for the guilty to feel better. It isn't for the victim. It's for the perpetrator's ego. I realized that if I didn't give you the truth, the ugly, unvarnished, career-ending truth, then I was still killing Caleb every single day. Restitution is the only true form of repentance. If I don't give you back what I took, his name and his land, then my sorrow is just vanity. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge. I laid it on the table next to the file. It looked small, flimsy. I'm done with it, I said. Authority is a trust, not a privilege. When a man in a position of power fails that trust, he forfeits the right to exercise it. I've been wearing this star like a shield to keep the world from seeing who I really am. But a badge should be a window. People should be able to look through it and see the values it represents. If the man behind the star is a coward, the star is just a piece of tin. I'm going to the circuit judge in the morning. I'm turning myself in for filing a false report and for the shooting. Abigail looked at the badge. Then she looked at me. The silence in the room was heavy. It was the kind of silence that changes a person's life. You'll go to prison, she said. Probably, I said, and I'll deserve it. Justice isn't just about punishing the bad men. It's about the fair application of the rules to everyone, especially the ones who wear the uniform. If I don't face the consequences of my actions, then the law means nothing. It just becomes a tool for the strong to bully the weak. I have to be willing to lose my freedom to prove that Caleb's life had value. That is the only way I can truly honor his memory. Abigail stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark ranch. You told me once that the greater good was a lie, she said, her back to me. You were right. The only real good is the one we do for the person standing right in front of us. You spent 4 years protecting a town that didn't know it was built on a grave. But tonight, you protected me. You gave me the truth when you could have kept the lie. She turned around. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked settled. A person's right to dignity doesn't end when they die, she said. Her voice was soft but steady. By telling me the truth, Silas, you gave Caleb his dignity back. You let him be a man who was just building a home instead of a ghost who was a target. That is a form of justice that a judge can't give me. It's a justice that can only come from one heart to another. I stood up too. My legs felt heavy, like lead. What will you do with the file? I asked. I'm keeping it, she said, because the truth belongs to the victim. It's not yours to give away anymore, and it's not Stursling's to hide. It's mine. I will decide how Caleb's story is told. That is what it means to have rights, to have control over your own narrative. She picked up the file and the badge. She handed the badge back to me. "Don't go to the judge yet," she said. "Why?" "Because Sterling is still out there, and he still has the deeds. If you go to prison now, he wins. He keeps the land. He keeps the water. He keeps the power." I looked at the tin star in my palm. It felt cold. True accountability requires us to fix the damage we caused, not just accept the punishment, Abigail said. She was standing tall now. The teacher, the widow, the survivor. "Going to a cell is the easy way out, Silas. It's a way to stop fighting. But I need you to fight. I need you to help me take back the valley. We owe it to the other families, the ones Sterling is squeezing, to break his hold. That is a higher form of justice than a prison sentence." I looked at her, and I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just guilt. It was purpose. "You're right," I said. "A man's debt to society isn't paid by sitting in a room. It's paid by standing up for the people he harmed. My life is forfeit either way. Abigail, I'd rather spend it tearing down the wall I helped Sterling build than rotting in a limestone box." I pinned the badge back on, not as a sheriff, but as a man with a job to finish. "We go to the ranchers' meeting on Friday," I said. "We show them the report. We show them the backdated ledgers. We tell them the truth in front of everyone. Public truth is the only thing that can kill a private lie," Abigail added. "Sterling thrives in the shadows. He thrives on the fact that everyone is too scared to speak up. But when one person tells the truth, it gives everyone else the permission to be brave. It's a ripple effect. That is how we change a culture of fear into a culture of rights." I walked to the door. I looked out at the horizon. The first hint of gray was touching the eastern peaks. "The morning is coming," I said, "and the light is going to hit everything, the good and the bad." Abigail came and stood beside me. She didn't touch my arm, but I could feel the heat of her standing there, a partner, an equal. "We are born with the right to live in the light," she said. "Sterling forgot that. You forgot that. But I'm here to remind you both." I looked at her, really looked at her. She was a woman who had been sold a night of shelter, and in return, she had given me back my soul. It was a lopsided trade, but I wasn't going to argue. "A night of shelter is a small thing," I said. "But a lifetime of truth, that's something else entirely." We stood there together as the sun began to climb. It was 1878 in the Colorado Territory. The world was hard, and the ground was hostile. But as the light hit the ranch, it didn't look like a cage anymore. It looked like a beginning. Healing doesn't mean the wound never existed, I thought, as the birds began to wake in the cottonwoods. It just means the wound no longer controls the man. I am a shooter who found his target, but this time, the target was the lie. We had 3 days until the meeting. 3 days to prepare for the end of the world as we knew it. But for the first time in 4 years, I didn't want to sleep through the sunrise. I wanted to see every bit of it. Because the truth, however much it costs, is the only thing that makes the air worth breathing. The ride to the western edge of the valley felt like a funeral procession for the man I used to be. The sun was hanging high and white. It wasn't the kind of light that warmed you. It was the kind of light that stripped everything bare. Abigail rode a few lengths ahead of me. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She knew I was there. I was the shadow she couldn't shake. We reached the acreage Caleb had claimed. It was a beautiful, brutal piece of earth, jagged rocks, high, golden grass that sighed when the wind touched it. And there, sitting in the middle of a clearing, was the cabin. It was a skeleton, a ghost of a home. Caleb had finished the walls and the roof, but the windows were just empty sockets, staring at the mountains. He hadn't gotten to the porch yet. The lumber for it was still stacked nearby, gray and weathered by 4 years of mountain snow. We dismounted. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest. "He built this for us," Abigail said. Her voice was steady. Too steady. She walked up the 2 steps and stood in the doorway. "He wrote to me about the floorboards. He said he chose the heart pine because it was strong, like us." I followed her inside. The air was cool and smelled of old sawdust. "Abigail," I said. I stopped near the center of the room. "A man's home is his ultimate sanctuary. It's not just a pile of wood and stone. It's the physical manifestation of his right to exist and his right to provide. When we allow a person to be driven from their home by force or by fraud, we aren't just breaking a law. We're breaking the fundamental contract of human civilization. A person's property is an extension of their very life. If a man isn't safe under his own roof, then no one is safe anywhere." She looked at the floor. She wasn't listening to the theory. She was looking for the man. "He told me in his last letter," she whispered. "He said if anything happened, if the big winds blew, I should look where the sun hits the corner at noon." I looked at the floor. The sun was just reaching a patch in the southwest corner. One board was slightly shorter than the rest. It didn't quite line up. I took my pocket knife and pried it up. There was a metal box tucked in the joists. I pulled it out and handed it to her. She opened it. Inside were maps, real maps, not the ones Sterling had filed. At the courthouse, there were survey markers, blueprints, and a stack of letters Caleb had written but never sent. I looked over her shoulder at the maps. My breath hitched. "It's the water," I said. "Look here." Caleb mapped the underground spring. It doesn't just touch this land. It's the headwater for the entire basin. If this land belongs to the Vance estate, then the Vance estate controls the lifeblood of every ranch for 50 miles. "That's why Sterling killed him," Abigail said. "He didn't just want the grass. He wanted the power to decide who lives and who dies in this valley. Power without accountability is the definition of tyranny," I told her. I felt the weight of the realization. Sterling believes that because he has the most cattle, he has the right to the most water. But the earth belongs to the people who work it, not the people who hoard it. Every person in this valley has an inherent right to the natural resources they need to survive. Water isn't a commodity to be stolen. It's a shared heritage. By hiding these maps, Sterling was stealing the future from every family in the territory. Abigail pulled out a final sheet of paper. It was a deed, a legitimate notarized deed from the territorial office. "He had it all," she said. Her voice finally broke. "He had the proof. He was coming to show the marshal. He was coming to show you." I looked at the date on the deed, November 14, 1874. The day he died. I stepped back. I felt the floorboards groaning under my boots. "Justice isn't a feeling, Abigail. It's a fact," I said. "We like to talk about justice as something that happens in the heart, but real justice is found in the records and the rights of the individual." Caleb Vance was a man of the law. He followed the rules. He did the paperwork. He trusted the system to protect him because he believed that the law was stronger than a bully's gun. My sin wasn't just pulling that trigger. My sin was betraying a man who believed in the same star I was wearing. We heard the sound of riders then. Not one or two, a dozen. I moved to the window. Sterling was out there. He was sitting on a white horse, looking clean and expensive. Beside him was his foreman, a man named Miller, who enjoyed his work too much. They had rifles. "Sheriff," Sterling shouted. His voice was loud and clear. the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. "I know you're in there, and I know the widow is with you. You're trespassing on my property, Silas. Come out, and we can settle this like gentlemen." I looked at Abigail. She was tucking the maps and the deed into her coat. She looked at me, and I saw a fire in her eyes that made the sun look dim. "We aren't coming out as trespassers," I yelled back. "We're standing on Vance land, Sterling, and we've got the papers to prove it." The silence that followed was long, cold. "Papers can burn, Silas," Sterling called out, "and people can disappear. You know how this works. You've been on my payroll for 4 years. Don't start growing a conscience now. It's a very expensive habit." I stepped onto the porch. I didn't draw my gun. I just stood there, my thumbs hooked in my belt. "Conscience isn't a habit, Sterling. It's a requirement," I said. I wanted every one of his hired hands to hear me. A man who sells his soul for a paycheck is just a slave with a better horse. You think you can buy the truth because you've bought the town. But a right doesn't go away just because it's hidden. Every man standing behind you has a right to be treated with dignity, but you're treating them like tools. You're asking them to commit murder for a man who wouldn't give them a glass of water if they were dying in the dirt. Sterling laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "You're a poet, Silas. But a poet doesn't survive a lead storm. Move aside. I want the woman and the box." Abigail stepped out beside me. She didn't hide behind my shoulder. She stood level with me. "The right to defend one's life and one's home is the most ancient right we have," she said, her voice ringing out across the clearing. "You killed my husband to take this land, Mr. Sterling, but a life is a sacred thing. You can't just erase a human being and expect the world to stay quiet. I am an American citizen, and I am standing on my own soil. If you want this box, you'll have to take it from the hands of a woman who has nothing left to lose but her honor." Miller, the foreman, raised his Winchester. I saw the hammer click back. "Wait," I said. From the trees to the east, more riders appeared. It was Sam Okafor, and with him were the Miller boys' father, the Bakers, and Ezra Hobbs. They weren't soldiers. They were ranchers. They were wearing work coats and holding old shotguns. They didn't look like a militia. They looked like a neighborhood. Sam rode forward, his face set. "Sterling," Sam said, "we heard the sheriff was out here. And we heard the widow Vance had found the water maps. We figured it was time for a town meeting. Right here. Right now." Sterling turned in his saddle, his face turning a dark, ugly red. "This is none of your business, Okafor. Go back to your scrawny herds." "An injury to one is an injury to all," Sam replied. "We've been silent because we were scared. We thought that as long as we kept our heads down, you'd leave us our scraps." But the sheriff reminded me of something. He said that a community that doesn't protect the rights of its weakest member is a community that's already dead. If you can do this to Abigail Vance, you can do it to any of us. We have a right to collective security. We have a right to stand together against a man who thinks he's the law. Sterling looked at the ranchers. Then he looked at his own men. I could see the calculation in his eyes. His hired guns were looking at the neighbors they drank with at the saloon. They were looking at the men who had helped them pull their wagons out of the mud last spring. The rifles in the hired hands' arms started to dip. "A man's primary duty is to his own humanity," I said, looking directly at Miller. "You don't owe Sterling your soul. You have a right to refuse an illegal order. You have a right to walk away from a crime. Don't throw your life away for a man who sees you as a ledger entry. Walk away." Miller looked at Sterling. Then he looked at the crowd. He spat in the dust, turned his horse around, and rode off. One by one, the rest followed. Sterling was left alone in the center of the clearing. He looked smaller now, just a man on a horse in a valley that didn't want him anymore. "This isn't over, Thorne," he hissed. "It is over," I said. I stepped off the porch and walked toward him. I reached up and took the white horse by the bridle. "You're going to the circuit, Judge Sterling. Not for a dinner, for a trial. You're going to be judged by the very people you tried to starve. That's how the law works when it's healthy. It's a tool for the many to protect themselves from the few. You thought you were the king of the basin, but in this territory, the only king is the truth." I led him away. Sam and the others fell in behind us. Abigail stayed on the porch of the cabin for a moment. She looked at the house Caleb had built. She looked at the lumber for the porch. I looked back at her. "Healing starts with the truth, but it ends with work," I said. "You have your land, Abigail. You have your name. Now you have a life to build, and a person has a right to build that life however they see fit." She smiled then. It was a small thing, but it was real. "I think I'll finish the porch first," she said. We rode back to town. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of violet and gold. It was 1878. The West was still wild, and the ground was still hard. But as we rode, I realized that the night of shelter was finally over. The sun was up, the secret was out, and for the first time in 4 years, I was riding toward the light instead of away from it. Respect for the individual is the only thing that keeps the wilderness from swallowing us whole, I thought. We are just people, flawed and broken. But when we stand up for each other's rights, we become something more. We become a society. We become a home. The trial would be long. The gossip would be loud. But as we entered Silver Creek, I didn't feel like a sheriff or a rancher or a shooter. I just felt like a man who had finally paid his debt. And that, I decided, was the only way to be truly free. The high country spring is a fickle thing. One day, the sun is a warm hand on your back. The next, the wind comes screaming off the peaks with enough ice to remind you that the mountains don't care if you're ready for the thaw. But that's the way of the world. Change doesn't come easy. It usually comes with a bit of a bite. It had been 2 months since Sterling was led away in irons. 2 months since the truth about Caleb Vance hit the streets of Silver Creek like a flash flood. The dust had settled, mostly. The trial in the circuit court was short. When the ledgers were shown and the hidden report was read, there wasn't much a high-priced lawyer could do. Sterling was gone. His empire was being carved up by the people he'd squeezed. I was no longer the sheriff. I'd handed in the Star for good the morning after the arrest. Sam Okafor was wearing it now. He was a better man for it. He didn't have the shadows in his eyes that I'd carried for 4 years. I stood on the porch of the Blackwood ranch house, watching the slush turn to mud in the yard. I was wearing my work coat. My hands were stained with cedar oil. I'd been spending my days fixing things. Fences, barn doors, things that had been neglected. While I was busy being a ghost, Abigail's daughter, Emma, was in the yard. She'd arrived from Boston 3 weeks ago with Abigail's mother. She was 5 years old. She had Caleb's stubborn chin and Abigail's amber eyes. She was chasing a stray hound I'd taken in, a scrawny thing that didn't know it was supposed to be a hunter. I watched her, and I felt a strange, quiet peace. "A child is the living evidence that the future is worth the fight," I said to the empty air. I found myself talking to the wind a lot lately. We spend so much of our lives looking backward at our mistakes. We obsess over the ruts we've made in the trail. But a child only looks forward. They have an inherent right to a world that isn't poisoned by the bitterness of their elders. If we don't clear the path for them, then our lives have been a waste of good oxygen. Abigail came out of the house. She was carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to me. She didn't stand behind me. She stood right beside me, shoulder to shoulder. The Miller family got their North Pasture back this morning, she said. That's good news. It's more than news, Silas. It's a restoration. She looked at me, her face catching the pale morning light. True restoration isn't just about getting back what was stolen. It's about the recognition that your worth was never tied to what you lost. Those families aren't just getting dirt and grass. They're getting their dignity back. They're being told by the world that they mattered. That's a human right that Sterling couldn't touch, though he tried his best to bury it. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and black. I went to the canyon yesterday, I said. Abigail went still, and I realized that forgiveness isn't a gift you give to someone else, I told her. I needed her to hear this. I needed to say it out loud so it would be real. It's a gift you give to yourself. I've been waiting for Caleb to forgive me from the grave. I've been waiting for you to say the words that would make the pain go away. But I was wrong. Forgiveness is the act of deciding that the past no longer has the power to dictate the present. I can't change the night I pulled the trigger, but I can choose to be the man who ensures it never happens to another soul. That choice is where my freedom lies. Abigail looked out at the mountains. She didn't answer right away. She was a woman who weighed her words before she spent them. Respecting a person means respecting their process of healing, she said finally. You want to be cured, Silas. You want the wound to be gone. But healing doesn't mean the scar isn't there. It just means the scar is part of your story now. You have a right to your own redemption, but you have to earn it every day. It's not a destination. It's a way of walking. Emma let out a high, bright laugh in the yard as the hound licked her face. She looks like him, I said. She has his heart, Abigail replied. She asks about him every night. I tell her the truth. I tell her he was a man who loved the land and loved her. I don't tell her the lie anymore. Honesty is the only foundation a person can truly build a life on. When we lie to children to protect them, we are actually robbing them of the tools they need to understand the world. They have a right to the truth of their own lineage, however hard it may be. The truth is the only thing that won't rot under their feet. We stood there for a long time, just watching the girl and the dog. Abigail was staying at the cabin on the Vance land. She'd finished the porch. She'd even painted the shutters a soft, welcoming blue. She was teaching at the schoolhouse 3 days a week. The town had embraced her, not out of pity, but out of respect. She was the woman who had stood up when everyone else was sitting down. I'm leaving for Denver on Tuesday, I said. Abigail turned to me, her brow furrowed. Why? To see the territorial governor. I'm going to petition for a change in the way the marshal's office handles land disputes. I want a mandatory oversight committee. Ranchers, not just lawmen. I want to make sure the greater good lie never gets told in this valley again. I looked at my calloused hands. Authority must be shared to be safe, I told her. The idea that one man with a badge can decide the fate of a family's heritage is a flaw in the system. Every citizen has a right to be judged by their peers, not by a single man in a dark canyon. I want to build a system where the law is a shield for the weak, not a club for the strong. If I don't use my experience to fix the cracks I fell through, then I'm still part of the problem. Abigail smiled. It wasn't the guarded smile I'd seen when she first arrived. It was a smile of genuine, horizontal respect. Equality isn't about being the same, Silas, she said. It's about having the same standing under the sun. You're finally acting like a man who knows he's no better and no worse than the people he serves. That's the only kind of leadership that deserves the name. You're not trying to be a hero anymore. You're just trying to be a neighbor. And in this country, a good neighbor is worth more than a dozen heroes. She stepped closer. She took the mug from my hand and set it on the railing. Before you go to Denver, she said, I have something to say. I'm listening. 2 months ago, I came to your door and begged you to sell me a night of shelter. I was a Goafu with a silver dollar and a heart full of shadows. You gave me the shelter, but you gave me something else too. You gave me the space to be angry. You gave me the space to find the truth. She looked me square in the eye. A real relationship isn't built on a lack of conflict, she said. It's built on the ability to survive it. It's about the right to be hurt and the right to be heard. You didn't try to silence my grief. You stood in it with me. That's a rare thing in a man, and it's a necessary thing for a woman like me. I felt my heart begin to thud in my chest, not with dread this time, with a terrifying, wonderful hope. Abigail, I said. I spent years thinking I was a solitary creature. I thought that being a man meant carrying the world alone. But I was wrong. We aren't meant to be silos. We are meant to be bridges. Every person has an inherent right to companionship that isn't based on need, but on choice. I don't need you to fix me, and you don't need me to save you, but I want to stand beside you. I took a breath. The mountain air was crisp and clean. Don't go back to the cabin tonight, I said, or tomorrow, or the day after. I know I have a lot of work to do. I know I'm a man with a heavy past, but I've learned that a home isn't a place you buy. It's a place you build with the person who knows your worst secrets and still wants to have breakfast with you. I looked at the silver dollar she'd placed on my table that first night. I had it in my pocket. I pulled it out and held it between us. Ownership is a small thing, I told her, but belonging, that's everything. You begged for a night of shelter, Abigail, but I'm asking you for a lifetime of partnership. I'm asking you to stay forever. Not as a ward, not as a victim, but as the mistress of this ranch and the partner of my soul. We have a right to a happiness that we've earned with our own sweat and our own truth. Abigail looked at the coin. Then she looked at me. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She reached out and closed my hand over the silver dollar. Love isn't a debt to be paid, Silas, she whispered. It's a garden to be tended. You don't owe me a life because of Caleb. You owe yourself a life because you're a human being who is still breathing. And I owe it to myself to choose a man who is brave enough to be honest. I'm not staying because of the past. I'm staying because I want to see what we build next. She leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a cinematic kiss. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and wind and the promise of a long, hard, beautiful life. I'll stay, she said, but I'm keeping my land, too. We'll be the biggest ranchers in the basin, and the most honest. I laughed. It was a sound that felt foreign in my chest, but it felt right. Partnership is the highest form of human interaction, I said. It's two independent souls deciding that the trail is better together. We'll have our own land and our own lives, but we'll share the same fire. That's the only way a man and a woman can truly be equal, by recognizing that neither one is the master of the other. Emma came running up the steps then, the hound at her heels. She looked at us, her head tilted to the side. Are you guys done talking? She asked. The dog found a rabbit hole, and I need help digging. Abigail laughed and caught the girl in her arms. She looked at me over Emma's head. Go help her dig, Silas, she said. I'll start the lunch. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the dirt with a 5-year-old and a scrawny dog. My back ached. My fingernails were black with soil. But I felt like a king. A man's true wealth is measured by the quality of the people who love him when he has nothing left to offer but himself. I thought as I watched Emma laugh. I was a sheriff. I was a rancher. I was a shooter. But none of those things mattered as much as the fact that I was now a man who could be trusted by a child. As the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, the valley turned into a sea of gold and purple. The shadows were long, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. They were just part of the landscape. The story of Silas Thorne and Abigail Vance wasn't a fairy tale. It was a Western. It was full of hard choices, bitter truths, and the kind of love that has to be forged in a furnace. But as I walked back toward the house, where the lights were glowing in the windows, and the smell of wood smoke was in the air, I knew one thing for certain. The night of shelter was over. The day of the truth had come. And in the Colorado Territory of 1878, that was enough. Every human being has a right to be home, I whispered to the rising moon. And I am finally, truly, home. I stepped through the door and closed it behind me. The wind stayed outside, the warmth stayed in. And the silence was no longer a cage. It was a sanctuary. On this channel, we share gripping Western tales about cowboys, love on the frontier, motherly sacrifice, compassion, human kindness, and the moral choices that define a life. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, like the video, comment your thoughts, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more Western journeys. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
In the end, this Western tale is not only about stolen land, a hidden deed, or a sheriff trying to correct an old wrong. It is a story about the heavy cost of silence, the courage it takes to face the truth, and the long road a broken soul must travel before redemption can begin. Sheriff Silas Thorne spent years believing that if he worked hard enough, stayed useful enough, and wore his badge proudly enough, he could outrun the night that destroyed Caleb Vance and left Abigail with nothing but grief. But the past does not disappear simply because a man refuses to speak of it. It waits. It gathers weight. And one day, it rides back to his door in the form of a widow asking for justice. Abigail's strength teaches us that sorrow does not have to make a person powerless. Her pain becomes purpose, her loss becomes courage, and her search for the truth becomes a light strong enough to expose the corruption of an entire valley. Through Silas and Abigail, the story reminds us that justice is not just a word written in a courtroom or pinned to a man's chest like a badge. Justice is a choice. It is the choice to stand up when fear tells you to stay quiet, to admit the truth when a lie would be easier, and to protect the dignity of another human being even when doing so costs you everything. The deepest lesson of this story is that redemption cannot be earned through regret alone. A guilty heart may suffer, but suffering is not the same as making amends. True redemption begins when a person takes responsibility, speaks honestly, and works to repair the harm they helped create. It also reminds us that no man is so powerful that he can own the truth forever, and no person is so small that their life, their home, or their dignity can be erased without consequence. In the harsh world of the frontier, where land, water, and survival often decide a person's fate, this story shows that compassion is still stronger than greed. Community is stronger than fear, and truth is stronger than any empire built on lies. May this tale stay with you as a reminder that every human being deserves to be seen, heard, and remembered with dignity. And when the time comes to choose between comfort and conscience, may we all have the courage to stand, like Abigail, on the ground of truth, and like Silas, to become better than the worst thing we have ever done.